Eli's family, how they would be destroyed. The Philistines were battling Israel during this time, and Israel took the ark into the battle. And following that, the ark was captured by the Philistines. And when Eli heard about it, he died. His sons died, and the daughter also died upon hearing about it, all within one day, as had been prophesied. And then the Philistines were plagued by this ark that they took, and so the ark was returned after 7 months, and many were killed for disrespecting the ark. They looked on it or looked in it, depending what you have there. And then Samuel, he became a judge, and he delivered Israel from the Philistines. So Samuel was the last prominent judge. His sons actually became judges as well, but they weren't oftentimes even counted as judges because they overlapped Samuel's lifespan, and also they didn't really have any prominent role there. So Samuel had been the judge. He delivered Israel. He was a good man. He was well respected, but of course, people wanted a king. And we're going to begin here in chapter 8, and that's where the story picks up. And I'm going to be reading here from the Septuagint, 1 Kings chapter 8. Now, when Samuel was old, he made his sons judges over Israel. And maybe I'll just break in here. It's interesting if you look at the chronology that Samuel was not very old. He was probably about 50 years old, and he actually lived after this about 60 years. So while it says he was old, there might be something else going on here. If you back up just a few verses to chapter 7, the last 2 verses, it says in verse 16, he went yearly on a circuit to Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, and he judged Israel in all those holy places. So it sounds like had been if you will, a circuit riding judge, right? He went around every year to this whole series of places and returned home to Ramah. And as we'll see later in chapter 9 or 10, we're going to come to it, where the people were now going to Samuel's house to be judged. So he either became too old to travel, or maybe he was ill or something. In any case, he wasn't going on his circuit anymore. And probably when that happened is when he made his sons judges, and maybe the people thought he was dying. I don't know, but they wanted him to make a king before he died. They said that you're old. Now, when Samuel was old, he made his sons judges over Israel, and these were the names of his sons. The firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second, Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba, but his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. Then all the men of Israel gathered and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Look, you have become old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now establish a king for us to judge us like all the rest of the nations." So why did they want a king? Anybody? Okay, so we're going to handle that after a little bit. All right, but this was evil in the eyes of Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Heed the voice of the people in whatever they might do, for they have not rejected you, but rather they have rejected me to bring to naught my reign over them. In everything they did to me since the day I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, they have forsaken me and have served other gods. So too they are doing this to you. Now listen to their voice. Only you shall testify solemnly to them and announce to them the custom of the king who will reign over them." So Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who asked him for a king. And he said, "This will be the custom of the king who shall reign over you. He will take your sons and put them in his chariots, and among his horsemen, and running before his chariots, and for himself he will appoint them as captains over his thousands and captains over his hundreds, and to harvest his crop and gather his vintage, and to make his weapons of war and instruments for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers, and he will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves, and give them to his servants. He will take a tenth of your grain and your vintage and give it to the eunuchs and servants. And he will take your male servants, your female servants, your finest cattle, and your donkeys, and take a tenth of them for his work. He will take a tenth of your sheep, and you will be his servants. Then in that day you will cry out before your king, whom you chose for yourselves, and the Lord will not hear you in those days, because you chose a king for yourselves. So the question comes up pretty obviously, was it wrong for Israel to have a king? So obviously, the people here are asking for a king, and Samuel is distressed about it. He talks to the Lord. The Lord says, they're rejecting me. So the question is, was it wrong for Israel to have a king? So that question here a little bit. So just a few observations. Many people have said, and I think I've heard this growing up, that it appears like God allowed a king as a concession. Kind of like in the Old Testament, we know from the New Testament that divorce was allowed by Moses because of the hardness of the people's heart. It wasn't God's intent, but you know what? I guess we'll just let them have it. And so then God allowed divorce. And so some people say, well, maybe that's what's happening here, that God is allowing them to have a king as a concession. Okay, it's not good, but all right, be that way. However, there's a few problems with that idea. One is that once they had a kingdom, God was blessing this monarchy, but he never said that he blesses divorce. There's something different there where, it's pretty distinct difference. Also, in the kingship of David, we get this messianic foreshadowing. So God chose a kingly line for the Messiah to be born in. Like Jesus didn't have to come from a kingly line. He could have come out of the prophets, or he could have come out of just a random Israelite or something. But here he comes out of this kingly line. Like, it's a little strange if they're not supposed to have kings, and if this is evil, that Jesus would be coming out of that line. And then from David to the time of Jesus, that goes through the exiles to the foreign nations and the whole return, and all that, for about 1,000 years, this lineage, this DNA from David, follows to the time of Jesus. And then in the New Testament, Jesus is referred to 10 times as the son of David. So when Jesus is called the son of David, this is maybe a little rabbit trail here, but if somebody is called the son of David in the time of Jesus, it meant something more than he was your great-grandpa. This is many generations removed, but they were looking forward to a son of David to come to be the Messiah. Okay? If I refer to you by calling you the son of your father or your great-great-great-great-grandfather or something like that, it doesn't have that kind of significance because we're not looking for a Messiah figure to come. But they were. And in fact, when Jesus is on the scene, some of the people said, could this be the son of David? And so they're looking for Messiah. Again, if it's wrong for them to have a king, it's very odd that Jesus would then come from that kingly line, which is given in a good sense, not in a bad sense. It's a blessing, not a curse. So that all of these things would indicate that having a king doesn't seem to be a concession, kind of like divorce was. So kingship is largely portrayed favorably. In Genesis 17, when God first called Abram to come out of, it's a few chapters later, but when God called Abram to come out of the land of the Chaldeans, God said to him, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It surely sounds like a blessing. And then, in the same chapter, God blessed Sarah and said, I will bless her, and also give you a son by her, and I will bless him, the son, and he shall become nations, and kings of people shall come from him. Again, it's portrayed favorably as a positive characteristic. And then their grandson, Jacob, the Lord said, I am your God, increase and multiply. A company of nations shall proceed from you, and kings shall come from your body. All of these given as blessings and not curses. And then as Jacob was giving his blessing to his sons, he blessed Judah and said, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from his loins until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the expectation of the nations." And the scepter and the lawgiver are references to royalty, to a king. All right, and then there's a greater context around that. Some of the preceding and following verses also give the same idea. And then there's more that we won't look at. We won't look up these verses, but Balaam's prophecy speaks of royalty. In Ruth's blessing, there is a reference to that as well. She has a genealogy that's recorded in the last verses of Ruth. And then also in Chronicles, we have a genealogy too. So it's very easy for us to come to genealogies and entirely skip over them. If you look at these genealogies, the one in 1 Chronicles, chapters 1 through 9, is the longest genealogical section in Scripture. Be a great thing to look at sometime. But in this section, you can see that it's following and progressing towards a king. And it leads up to David and so on. And the same thing is actually true there of Ruth as well. It gives the genealogy there of Ruth from her to David. And then in the Psalms, we have all kinds of things referring to royalty and kingship. So all these things would seem to indicate that God thinks well of kingship. But if that's true, then why does it sound so disfavorable here in this passage that we read in 1 Samuel chapter 8? And I think that what we need to do first is ask the question, what was kingship supposed to look like? Okay, so if kingship is as God intended it to be, what does that mean? If you think of a contemporary example of the United States, we don't have kings, but we have president. And, there's a lot of negativity about the presidency, and it's pretty obvious why. But you need to ask, what was it supposed to be? And to know that, you need to go back to the Constitution and say, this is what it was supposed to be. Now we can say that was good, if it was good or whatever, and measure it by what the intent was, and then we can just say that that's not what we have today. So if you back up to Deuteronomy, the Lord gives instructions in Deuteronomy for when they have a king. And I think this is fascinating because they didn't have a king, and they were under Moses at that time. They were centuries away from David, or even from Saul. They were centuries away from this time, and God said, if you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, and you inherit it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a ruler over me like the remaining nations around me, you shall surely set a ruler over you, whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your brethren you shall set as a ruler over yourself. You cannot set a foreigner over yourself, because he is not your brother. Wherefore he shall not multiply a cavalry for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt. For the Lord said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart be changed. Nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. And it shall be, when he sits on the throne of his rule, that he shall write for himself a copy of this second law in a book from the one before the priests, the Levites. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and be careful to observe all these commandments and ordinances, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, and may prolong his rule, he and his sons among the sons of Israel. So now we have a little clue of what God intended for a king to look like. It's one whom the Lord chooses. It's of their own people. And then it says he's not supposed to multiply his cavalry. That means he's not supposed to spend a lot of time even thinking about making his army bigger. Whatever they have for an army, okay, that's fine. Don't even waste time with that. They're not supposed to go back to Egypt. They're not supposed to multiply wives to themselves. And maybe just looking at that, why is it that this is a problem with kings? Why is it that kings oftentimes would get more wives than other people? Anyone know the answer to that? I mean, it could be anybody, right? And sometimes there were other people that, got other wives. But why was it kings that would do this? Okay. Go ahead. Okay. And you were going to say? Yep, so that's correct. All right, so what they would do is, in the interest of keeping peace between nations, if I'm one nation and there's another nation, between this nation and that nation, the kings will trade women for wives so that in the event of a war or a conflict, the two are less likely to fight because they know that somebody is on the other side that they're going to harm. And so anyway, I think that's part of the reason why they would have this propensity among the kings to multiply wives, because the multiplicity of wives was typically foreign wives. It wasn't like they just want a bunch of wives, but they're doing this for political purposes, for the potential conflicts. All right, and then must not accumulate riches. And then this king, it says, is to write, I have a note here, write a personal copy of Deuteronomy. So where do we know, how do we know that this was to be the book of Deuteronomy? If you look at verse 18, that's right. It says in verse 18 that he shall write for himself a copy of this second law in a book. Okay, so the second law, the word deutero, is second. Number 2, deutero. And then nomos is law. The word Deuteronomy means second law. And he shall write a copy of the second law. He shall write a copy of Deuteronomy. And so this is actually written in Deuteronomy, chapter 17. So when he is writing this law, he's actually writing the same thing that he's supposed to write, a law. Anyway, so he's supposed to write a personal copy of the book of Deuteronomy. It also says in that same verse 18, it says, also it shall be when he sits on the throne of his rule. So I'm not a Semitic linguist, but the Hebrew scholars understand that when it says that when he sits on the throne of his rule, it means when he ascends to rule, like when he becomes the king, not only while he is king, but when he becomes the king. At the beginning of his rule, this is like the first business that he's supposed to do. He's supposed to write for himself a copy of the second law. All right, and then he's to keep this copy with him, and he's supposed to read it daily. So every day he is supposed to spend time reading the book of giving of the second law, so that he would fear the Lord. So this king is supposed to be somebody who fears the Lord and observes all of his commands, so that he remains humble and doesn't raise himself up to be greater than his brothers. So it says that his heart may not be lifted up above his brethren. So this is not a picture of what you might think of as a typical king. When you think of a king, at least even in our contemporary times, the king is usually the commander of the military. In the United States, we have the president's one title is the commander-in-chief. He's the one who runs the military. And the same thing is true in every war. If there's ever a war, if it's Putin's war, if it's Ukraine's war, it's always the top leader who runs the military. And so a few things about that. One is he's not supposed to multiply his cavalry. He's not supposed to increase his weapons, and so on. All right. Moving on from that, let's just think about those qualifications of what this kingship is supposed to look like. Does that sound like the kind of king that Israel was requesting? And then how do we know? So I think the first answer is pretty obvious. I mean, at least we know that that's not what he turned out to be. But how do we know, even before we read the record of Saul's life, of what he was going to do? We kind of have a pretty good clue from Samuel, because Samuel told them what he's going to be like. So Samuel said, all right, you want a king. So this is what's going to happen. He's going to take your sons for his military. And he's going to take your children to tend his farms and to manufacture weapons and to make his food. Now, when it says make his food, it's not talking about having somebody to make lunch for him or something like that. It's talking about supplying the military. He's going to build up a military. He's going to be manufacturing weapons. And when it says to attend his farms, that's because they're farming for the king's military. And then he's going to confiscate your best possessions, and he's going to tax you, and so on. Does that sound like the qualifications of a king? Not at all. So what Samuel is warning them about is entirely that they are going to get somebody that's going to try to build up a nation, a military empire. So what would a good king look like? So we have in Deuteronomy the Shema. And if you're not aware of this, you can learn today. So the Shema is a prayer, if you will, from chapter 6, verse 4 and 5. It's 2 verses. It's very short. And it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God from your whole heart, from your whole soul, from your whole power." And this Shema was something that was recited by the Israelites, at least the observant Israelites, twice a day, every morning and evening, in their prayers and in their chants and recantations. They would say this, and that continues to this day. The Shema is the one verse that the 2 verses that every Israelite knows, because this is still recited to this day. If we think of our most common verse, John 3:16 or something like that, this is their verse. So a good king, and not just the king, but all of them, but for sure the king, should be observing this, that they're supposed to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your power. So in the divided kingdom, so we have Saul, we have David, and then we have Solomon, and then after Solomon, we have Rehoboam and Jeroboam. It became this divided kingdom between the north under Israel, by the name of the nation, whatever, the tribes of Israel, and then the south was the tribes of Judah. In the north, after Rehoboam and Jeroboam, after the division of the kingdom, there was 0 good kings, none of them. And then in the south, by the way, the north and the south, they both had 20 kings. The north had 20, they were all bad. The south had 20, and only 8 of those are described as being good. But even with the good, there's some qualifiers. Because of these 8 that were good, 6 of them did not remove the high places. So that leaves only 2 of them that were good, and they removed the high places. And those 2 were Hezekiah and Josiah. So these are good names. Hezekiah and Josiah are good kings and very rare among the people. So Hezekiah, this is the commentary. He trusted in the Lord God of Israel, so that after him was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor who were before him. Like, that's a pretty good thing to read about yourself, if that would be said of us. And then for Josiah, it says, "Now before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart, with all his soul, and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses, nor after him did any arise like that." Now, when you read that about Josiah, what does that sound like? What does that remind you of? Yeah, Deuteronomy 6, where the Shema is given. It says that there wasn't anybody like him who loved the Lord with all his heart and soul and all his might. So that's what a good king should look like. And just speaking of good kings, and we have Hezekiah here. So if he was a good king, then we know that he was doing what they were intended to do, these qualifications for a king. That means that he was not expanding his army. He was not recruiting all these soldiers. He was not taking their servants to fight in his military. So then what did he have for a military? Hezekiah, the story there in the Kings, in Hezekiah's account is where this Assyrian king, Sennacherib, came against Israel. I'm not going to look at that here right now, but if you recall the story, Sennacherib sends a letter to Hezekiah and says, we're coming to fight, but don't even try to, fight back. Just surrender, because nobody stands up to us. And Hezekiah is fearful for his nation, and he takes this letter and he presents it to the Lord, and he's like, what are we supposed to do? They talk to the prophet, and all these things go on. And then what happened to the Assyrian king and military? You know the story, you might recall. Okay, so that's actually a different account. But yeah, so an angel came during the night and wiped out their army, like 180,000, whatever the number was. And there was zero fighting that went on. And this is a different topic for a different time, but I think that a case could be made that a lot of the fighting that happened in the time of Israel didn't have to happen. And that would be an example. There you have a king who didn't even have much of a military, and the Lord takes care of it, right? And then you have other kings that increase their military, like Saul, and he's ultimately destroyed in a battle and the nation loses. That's a big deal. All right, anyway, that's a rabbit trail, and we can look at that some other time. Okay, so we're going to continue here. The chapter 8 closes with these verses. It says, "But the people were unwilling to listen to Samuel, and they said to him, 'No, rather it is that we want a king to be over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, and our king will judge us and go out before us and fight our battles.' And Samuel heard all the words of the people and repeated them in the hearing of the Lord. So the Lord said to Samuel, 'Heed their voice, make them a king.' And Samuel said to the men of Israel, 'Let every man go back to his city.'" So in this chapter, actually we'll get to that in just a moment, but in this chapter 8, the word king is used a lot. It's used 9 times, and that's interesting as we come into chapter 9, which is where we're going to go in just a moment. So just to answer the question, was it wrong for Israel to have a king? I would say the answer is no. The question is, what kind of king did God intend? And what the people here wanted is they wanted a king to take care of the Philistines. Samuel, you drove out the Philistines, but now you're old. Maybe they thought he's going to die, whatever. He's got bad sons, and they're like, we need a king to take care of these Philistines. And I think that was the problem, that they were not seeking the Lord's power and deliverance for them. All right, so let's look in 1 Kings chapter 9, next chapter. "There was a man from the sons of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, the son of Apha, a Benjamite, a man of power. He had a tall and handsome son whose name was Saul. There was no more handsome person than he among the children of Israel. He was a head taller than anyone else in the land." Take the tallest person, he's a head taller. All right, so what other Israelite does Saul remind you of here? And we're going to look at a few hints. So between Saul and somebody else that you know about, they both had a mission to deliver Israel from the Philistines. And on both of them, and we'll come to some of these details as we read on in the story, the Spirit of the Lord rushes upon them. And that happened to Saul, and it happened to somebody else. And because of disobedience, this Spirit of the Lord was removed from them. And both of them are humiliated by the Philistines. Both of them died among a crowd of others who were dying, and both of them were physically impressive. And who does that remind you of? Okay, Samson. So Samson and Saul actually have some amazing similarities. But the question is, why? So what is significant about that? Like, it could be anybody, right? But for some reason it's Samson, who had not lived too long before them. Any thoughts about that? So just one clue. Samson was a judge, right? And they're coming out of the time of the judges. And they're like, we're tired of this. We don't want what we've had for all this time in the past. We want something different. We need a king. And Samson was just behind them. Now they have a king who does the same thing as Samson did. It's Samson is like a prototype of Saul. Saul is a copy of Samson, even though they want something entirely different, end up with the same thing. Isn't that interesting? All right, let's keep going here. All right, so we have Saul was introduced to us. We have this young man. He's tall, he's handsome, whatever, and his dad has some donkeys. Now the donkeys of Kish, Saul's father, were lost. And Kish said to his son Saul, "Take one of the servants with you, and arise, go and look for the donkeys." So they passed through the mountain of Ephraim, and through the land of Shalisha, but they did not find them. Then they passed through the land of Shalem, and they were not there. Then he passed through the land of the Benjamites, but they did not find them. When they had come to the land of Zuph, Saul says to his servant who was with him, "Come, let us return, or my father will stop worrying about the donkeys and become worried about us." All right, funny little story there, maybe. But you will notice, and we're going to keep seeing this as we go through here, that Saul is the one who has like the least leadership. So what does he say? Here it says, "Let's go home. I'm tired of this. All right, I'm not going to persevere. I don't know about you, but I don't know. Let's just go home. I don't care about my dad's donkeys anymore. All right, let's keep going." And the servant said, okay, who came up with this idea? The servant says, "Look now, in this city there is a man of God, and he is an honorable man. All that he says surely comes to pass. So now let us go there. Perhaps he can tell us the way we should go." Then Saul, okay, so before we go there, so the servant has this great idea. He's like, "Hey, look, we can solve this. We got a man of God here." Does Saul get on board? He's like, "Well, yeah." He says, "Look, if we go, what will we bring the man of God? The bread in our vessels is all gone, and there's no more that belongs to us to bring to the man of God." It's like, "We got a problem. We don't have anything to give him. Let's go home." And the servant answered Saul again and said, "Look, I have here in my hand 1/4 of a shekel of silver. Give it to the man of God to tell us our way." I'm going to skip a few verses. So they went up to the city, and as they were coming into the midst of the city, there was Samuel coming out to meet them on his way up to the high place. Now, the day before Saul arrived, the Lord revealed to the ear of Samuel, saying, "Tomorrow about this time I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him commander over my people Israel. He shall save my people from the hand of the Philistines, for I have looked upon the humiliation of my people, because their cry has come to me." Notice in verse 16, the Lord told Samuel that he will have him anoint a commander. And just keep that in mind. We'll come to that in just a little bit. So when Samuel saw Saul, the Lord said to him, "There he is, the man whom I spoke to you. This one shall rule over my people." And there we have another phrase, "shall rule over my people." We'll come to that. Then Saul approached Samuel in the midst of the city and said, "Please tell me, where is the seer's house?" Actually, Saul, now that they're there, he's like, where is he? And Samuel answered Saul and said, "I am he. Go up before me to the high place and eat with me today, and in the morning, before I send you forth, I will tell you all that is in your heart. But as for your donkeys lost 3 days ago, do not let your heart be anxious about them, for they have been found. And to whom is the beauty of Israel? Is it not on you and on your father's house?" Then Saul answered and said, "Am I not a son of Benjamin, of the smallest branch of the tribes of Israel, and my family the least of all the tribes of the branch of Benjamin? Why then do you speak to me like this?" Now Samuel took Saul and his servant and brought them into the hall, and he set a place for them among the chief of those who were called, about 70 men. And Samuel said to the cook, "Bring the portion I gave you, which I told you to set beside you." So the cook lifted up the thigh and set it before Saul. Then Samuel said to Saul, "Behold, a remnant is set before you. Eat, because it is placed in front of you as a testimony to the others. Take of it." On that day, Saul ate with Samuel. Interesting story. So we got a group of 70 people together, about 70, and among them, Saul and Samuel, and there's a cook. And in advance, Samuel had told the cook, "Hey, keep this special little thigh here, and we're going to give that to Saul specifically." And so now, in the presence of all of them, so that all the others would see, it says there, they gave this. "Behold, a remnant is set before you. Eat, because it's placed in front of you as a testimony to the others. There's something special about this man. We're going to give him some special meat, and that's going to be significant. When they had come down from the high place into the city, they spread a bed for Saul on the housetop. He slept. As the morning dawned, Samuel called to Saul on the housetop, saying, "Rise up, that I may send you on your way." Remember we were talking about how Saul doesn't take the initiative for anything? It's actually Samuel that needs to get him out of bed in the morning. It's exactly what happened here. And Saul arose, and he and Samuel went outside. As they were going down to the outskirts of the city, Samuel said to Saul, "Tell the servant to go on ahead of us, but you stand here today and give heed to the word of God." All right, so I had mentioned this earlier, that in chapter 8, we have the word king used 9 times. That's the chapter where the people are saying, "We want a king." And Samuel goes before the Lord and so on about this. In chapter 9, which is what we just read, the language is different. And we read here in verse 16 that the Lord said to Samuel that you shall anoint. He didn't say anoint a king. He uses a different word here. He says you can anoint a commander. Because kings are supposed to be good people. And I think that there's something significant that God didn't say anoint a king. He says anoint a commander. And a commander is a different kind of person. So the king, as they were intended to be, is going to be a godly person who writes the scriptures and reads the scriptures and fears the Lord, and he's humble and all these things. And God says to Samuel, you're going to be anointing a commander. That's like a ruler, or it's probably in a military thought here. And he's going to save the people from the hand of the Philistines. And then the following verse, Samuel introduced, or actually the Lord said to Samuel, that this is the one who shall rule over my people. Different language from saying, this is your king. It's like he's a commander. He's going to be the one to rule. Anyway, that's interesting. Okay, so we're going to go on into the next chapter. Then Samuel took a vial of olive oil and poured it on Saul's head and kissed him and said to him, "Has not the Lord anointed you as a ruler?" Interesting. "To his people over Israel. You shall rule among the people of the Lord, and you shall save them from the hand of the enemies round about them. For you this shall be a sign that the Lord anointed you as a ruler for his inheritance." How many times do we have this rule? We're going to take care of the Philistines. And that's because he's a different kind of a king, not what the Lord had said in Deuteronomy that they're supposed to be looking for. Verse 2, "As you depart from me today, you shall come to find 2 men by Rachel's tomb in the territory of Benjamin, who are jumping about ecstatically. And they will say to you, 'The donkeys you search for are found, but take notice your father stopped worrying about the news concerning the donkeys and is anxious about you, saying, "What shall I do about my son?" Then you shall go from there and come to the oak tree of Tabor. There you shall find 3 men going up to God at Bethel, one carrying 3 young goats, one carrying 3 containers of bread, and one carrying a skin of wine." All this is foretold of what he will discover. "And they will entreat you in peace and give you 2 loaves of bread, which you shall take from their hands." Keep notice of what you're supposed to do. "After this you shall come to the hill of God, which for the Philistines is the high place there. The Philistine Nazib is located there. And when you enter the city, you will meet a band of prophets coming down from the high place with a stringed instrument, a tambourine, a flute, and a harp before them. They will be prophesying. Then the Spirit of the Lord will come upon you, and you shall prophesy with them, and you shall be turned into another man. And when these signs shall come to pass for you, do all the many things your hand finds to do, because God is with you. You shall go down before me to Gilgal, and I will come down to you to offer burnt offerings and peace offerings. You shall wait for 7 days till I come to you and show you what to do." All right, so as you will notice here, he's going to be coming among these prophets, and the Spirit of the Lord is going to come on him, and he's going to prophesy too, and he's going to turn into another man. For all the liabilities of Saul, it can't be said that God didn't give him a chance. Like, God really saw a flawed person, but said, I'm going to give him everything that he needs to be a good king. I'm going to give him my spirit. I'm going to give him the presence of all these prophets. I'm going to tell him what to do. And it can't be said that Saul didn't have opportunity. And he had a prophet who tells him what's going to happen. And among the things that he tells him are supposed to happen, he says that you're supposed to go down to Gilgal and wait for 7 days until I come, and then I'll tell you what to do after that. All right, what did he do? So it came about that when he turned his back to depart from Samuel, God gave him another heart. And all the signs came to pass on that day. All the signs came to pass on that day. All these things. He saw it like this is clear to him that this is the work of God. And he came there to the hill, and behold, there was a band of prophets opposite him, and the Spirit of God came upon him, and he prophesied in the midst of them. It came about that all those who had seen him previously saw it, and behold, he was in the midst of the prophets. And the people said, each one of his neighbor, what is this that has happened to the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets? And one of them answered and said, but who is his father? Therefore it became a proverb, truly even Saul is among the prophets. And he finished prophesying and came to the hill. Then his kinsman said to him and his servant, where did you go? So he said, to look for the donkeys. We saw they were lost. We went to Samuel. And the kinsman said to Saul, what did Samuel say to you? So Saul said to his kinsman, in his explaining, he told me where the donkeys were found. But he did not tell him the matter of the kingdom. Then Samuel proclaimed to all the people in the presence of the Lord at Mizpah, and to the sons of Israel, he said, thus says the Lord God of Israel, I brought the sons of Israel up from Egypt and delivered you from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and from all the kingdoms that oppressed you. But today you rejected God, who himself is your Savior, from all your adversaries and tribulations. And you said to him, no, set a king over us. Therefore now stand before the Lord according to your tribes and according to your families. Then Samuel brought near all the tribes of Israel, and by lot the tribe of Benjamin was chosen. And he brought near the tribe of Benjamin by families, and by lot the family of Matri was chosen. And the men of the family of Matri came near, and by lot Saul, the son of Kish, was chosen. Got something wrong there. Go down to about the fourth or fifth line. But when Samuel sought him, he could not be found. Verse 22. So Samuel asked yet again of the Lord, has this man come here yet? And the Lord answered, look, he is there hidden among the equipment. So they ran and brought him from there. And when Saul stood among the people, he was a head taller than all the other people. Then Samuel said to all the people, do you see whom the Lord has chosen for himself, that there is no one like him among all of you? All the people recognized and understood and said, long live the king. So who used the word king here? It's actually the people calling him a king. Like the Lord and the prophet didn't do that. Then Samuel explained to the people the custom of the king, and he wrote it in a book and placed it before the Lord. And Samuel sent all the people away, and every man went to his place. And Saul also went home to Gibeah, and with Saul the sons of valor, whose hearts the Lord inspired. But perverse men said, how shall this man save us? So they despised him and brought him no gifts. All right, so if you recall, and you can look back through here, I'm just going to keep this pretty short. So if you will recall, one of the commands that the prophet Samuel had given to Saul is that after all these signs happen and you're among the prophets and you're prophesying and so on, that's, by the way, when he then, pretty soon after that is when he got anointed king. He's supposed to go to Gilgal. But here it says in verse 26 that he went home to Gibeah. He was supposed to go to Gilgal and wait 7 days, and then the prophet is going to meet him there and tell him what's next. That didn't happen. So after he is among the prophets and he's prophesying and he gets anointed, then actually they're going to anoint him and he's nowhere around. They had to search him out. They find him hiding. And finally they get him anointed, and then he went home. He went home to Gibeah, it says in verse 26, instead of going to Gilgal like he was supposed to. And people are saying, how shall this man save us? It says it's perverse men, and obviously these people had no confidence in him. Probably they should have been more godlike, where even God gave him great opportunity. but it's understandable why they would, probably not have very much confidence there. Yeah, all right. So that actually concludes the passage that we're going to look at there. I think basically we see what happens when people follow their own way. You can see that in the life of the nation as a whole, where they want to have a king who is going to deliver them. It was a rejection, God said, of himself, and they end up with this king who has no, seemingly very little, if any, fear of God. And when we continue on at another time, we're going to notice that, um, among the people of God, even among Israel, there's going to be some who are like really on fire for the Lord, and there's others who are, whatever, just coasting along. But in the case of Saul, it doesn't appear like he was either of these. We don't have that in this passage. We'll look at this at a later point. But besides the two groups that I mentioned, those who are really on fire for the Lord and those who are just coasting along and so on, there would be another class of people, and those are they who do not even worship the Lord at all, who are not followers of Yahweh. And I think this is something that we can make a strong case for coming up, that that Saul was not a Yahwist. He was not a follower of Yahweh. He was actually somebody who was serving other gods, he was of a different religion, if you will. And of course, Samuel probably knew this. The Lord knew this, and yet the people were getting what they asked for in looking for a commander to lead them. And then as we continue, we will also see how it turned out for not only for the nation, but for Saul personally, with his shallow character and so on. All right, I think we'll close with that. As far as the meeting today,